Hey everyone, today we're excited to welcome Dr. D.C. Schindler, Professor of Metaphysics and Anthropology at the Pontifical John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family in Washington, D.C. Dr. Schindler is renowned for many influential works, including Freedom from Reality, The Diabolical Character of Modern Liberty, The Politics of the Real, the Church Between Liberalism and Integralism, and Love in the Postmodern Predicament. In our conversation, we explore philosophy as a way of life, the importance of recovering a sense of beauty in our modern world, the limits of liberalism, and the source of true renewal. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel and share it with others who might find it inspiring. Your support helps us continue exploring profound questions and bring meaningful discussions to life. Thank you for listening. I wanted to start actually with a question about philosophy as a way of life, your own journey with philosophy, not just as a part of, something that you do with your head, but as a way of life, and your own journey with it.
Yes, maybe this is the best way in. My father always used to say, he was a wealth of philosophical wisdom, but one of the things that I remember when I was young, he said, pointing to the three transcendentals, truth, beauty, and goodness, that every genuine human life devoted itself to one of these three. And the question is, which of the three is going to be yours? So beauty, you follow the arts somehow. Truth would be philosophy, goodness, one of the saints. And it's interesting. I was always torn because, in one respect, an interest in philosophy grew fairly early for me. Although I at first thought I wanted to be a painter. Vincent van Gogh was a very compelling figure to me. But after a time, I realized I was more interested in his letters than his paintings, and that kind of helped me see it was philosophy. But it was interesting. In spite of the fact that philosophy drew me, I always saw philosophy in a basic way connected to beauty. Uh-huh. And I think it was the dimension of beauty that integrated goodness. So it wasn't simply about insight into truth, but also having that bear fruit in one's life. And actually, Kierkegaard was also an important person for me early on. This idea of gesticulating with one's whole existence when you speak about the truth, that there's a sense in which you really, the way you live and the way you think can't be separated so cleanly, and that somehow beauty seems to capture that. For reasons I think I've come to understand better theoretically more recently, but I think I had a kind of a glimpse of that as a teenager. This was my last couple years of high school.
Was there in terms of this, was there an experience of beauty during that period that drew you, or was it more the realization that or was it an intellectual experience of beauty? I'm just curious about, because sometimes one of the things I've always was accused of was don't overthink it, but there's sometimes where ideas are very beautiful, like your whole being is moved by it, and so I'm just curious about what this experience of beauty was for you.
That's really interesting that you put it that way. I remember, in the stormy high school years that we all experience, having a girl I was dating, telling me accusing me of living in my head because I was always working on and I remember just thinking that she totally misunderstood for some reason. The idea that these ideas were in my head or something. For me, it was absolutely about how to live, and thinking was a way of deepening experience and entering more deeply into one's relationships with things and with people and the world around. So I never quite understood that accusation of philosophy as as indulging in abstractions. That never really made an impression. And the figures I mentioned, Van Gogh and Kierkegaard. Nietzsche was an early one too. A book that I read that I really recommend, even though it's a curious, kind of a strange book. It made a huge impression on me. It really, I sort of owe my my philosophical vocation, such as it is, to this book. Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance.
Oh, wow, yeah.
Robert Pirsig. That's actually a really interesting book. I mean, it ends up taking a kind of an Eastern kind of Zen, obviously, Buddhist, although it's his own version of Buddhism. It sort of takes a turn, and that wasn't the part that was compelling to me. What was compelling to me was the integrity of this man's desire to understand for him, what's driving the book is that what is quality, and really it's what is beauty. That's what he's trying to figure out, what beauty is, and he devotes his entire existence. There's a profound passion and uncompromising effort to answer this question. That made an immense impact on me in high school. So I think it would have been very different if I had gotten into philosophy because I got excited about learning how to make sophisticated arguments or something like that. But that really was not what attracted me at all. It was the beauty of a kind of philosophical witness of a life, I think.
What is the relationship do you see between one's philosophic, conception of the world, one's philosophy, and one's life? It's sort of a heavy truth, but something that I'm convinced of, and I'll explain why I say heavy in a moment. You can't separate your life and your thinking, which means I mentioned Nietzsche a moment ago. He really is outstanding on this. This is when he muses on even getting his first typewriter and typing, and initially he's thrilled by this machine, but he begins to realize that typing his thoughts changes his thoughts. I mean, there's something about what one does that has an immediate impact on one's thinking. Now that gets multiplied when you're talking about moral questions or decisive questions about the kinds of patterns of life that you fall into. And the reason I said it's a heavy truth is, I have to remind myself sometimes if I begin to drift into, indulging in trivialities. In one sense, you might say these things are harmless, and morally they might be genuinely trivial. But you realize to give yourself to those things, it's actually going to change the way that you think, and change the way that you teach, and change the way that you write. And I've seen this happen in some teachers and certainly authors that I've read. When you sort of trace their life, you see how basic decisions they make or ways of life that they adopt, it has a deep effect on what they talk about and how they talk about it, and whether they're able to give substance to their words or not. Charles Péguy, another one of these really extraordinary figures, all from the late 19th, early 20th century. He said, you can tell the difference in an author between one who writes in ink and one who writes in blood. There's something. There really is something to that. But again, it's a heavy thing because it would be much easier if you could separate the two. Some Christians have made the argument that philosophy really is antithetical to Christ's admonition to be as to be childlike, to be as simple as doves. And you mentioned this towards the end of Love and Postmodern Predicament as a kind of defense of philosophy. What would you say to those that would say, well, the church and Christianity, we don't need any of that philosophy, that this is alien to this revelation that comes? kind of that basic kind of critique that some of the some Protestants might make that. But what would be your response to that?
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. One can never know, with these counterfactuals, historical counterfactuals. But I think a strong case could be made that we would know absolutely nothing about Greek philosophy if it weren't for Christianity. The way that the church inherited, carried into itself, brought into itself the thinking of the Greeks and the political form of the Romans and the theological spirit of the Jews, that the church really is a synthesis of those things. I think that's determinative and definitive of Western civilization. So I'm giving a historical answer here first. I'd like to say something personally about it too. But historically speaking, there's philosophy goes hand in hand with the Christian tradition in a way that it doesn't fit quite so well with really any other religion. One might say in Islam you had in the Middle Ages this sort of explosion of interest in Aristotle, but as Remy Brague has shown so clearly, and he knows this area better than anyone in the world really, that typically the Muslim thinkers who were philosophers were not welcomed by, they were sort of outsiders to the faith. There was a real tension there. In Judaism, it's the same sort of thing, that there's not, philosophy has never entered into the center of the Jewish tradition, and these are just the main sort of monotheistic religions that we're familiar with. But in Christianity, philosophy entered into the center, and it was really given a home and made decisive, and in fact made fruitful in defining dogma and so forth. The Protestant Reformation is a rejection of a lot of that inheritance, but that's very evidently a part of the church from its origins until the 16th century. Now, personally speaking, or in terms of just the way one approaches things today, I think this question of whether philosophy belongs to Christianity is really an important one that we need to recover and think about anew, in large part against the growing anti-intellectual drift that one finds everywhere in the culture these days. When I have, Hunters from Balthasar said it was precisely the task of the Christians to be the guardians, the custodians of the philosophical act. And that's hard to understand if you think of philosophy as learning how to make abstract arguments and things. But if it means the love of wisdom, and if the heart of it is wonder over the gift of being, then every Christian has to be a philosopher in order to be a good Christian. Whether one ends up doing that professionally or in a more systematic way is a second question, but every Christian needs to be a philosopher.
It's interesting. You say that modern culture is largely a conspiracy to protect us from the real. And I'm really curious, in a lot of your writing, you talk about that there's a real interest in reality. So freedom from reality, one of your works. What has happened in the last few centuries? What has happened where it seems like in the culture there was a real appreciation for philosophy as a way of knowing truth and in the highest form of truth, contemplating the true, really giving you access to reality. And then there's this move where we become focused on technical knowledge. How do we manipulate things? How do we it's a kind of practical knowledge, which it has its role, but that it sort of usurps this more ancient notion of contemplation. What is this shift that's taken place, and why is it so dangerous, and how is it that we're really in danger of losing touch with reality itself in losing that philosophic sort of disposition?
You're touching on a subject that's very close to my heart, and I could talk about this for hours, but I know that we don't have that time. I do want. It seems to me that I do want to go what I think is the deepest cause of this, but it really goes deep and it's controversial, but and takes some contextualizing and so forth. But let me just begin with it. I mean, it's the incarnation. When Christ entered, when God became incarnate in the man Jesus Christ, that was a move into the flesh and therefore into the reality of the created world. So the church is the extension of the incarnation, and the church, as the faith was embodied in culture, has to be most fundamentally understood as a kind of an extension of the incarnation. And what that means, insofar as that succeeds, and insofar as Christ really did enter into the world, in a way, he became inseparable from reality. So it seems to me that when the world began to break away, basically from the Catholic Church, so from the historically continuous tradition, Orthodox as well, I would include them as having this historical continuity. There are all sorts of reasons for the Protestant Reformation and the various movements, and a lot that one can say is sort of understandable given the time. But I think tragically, and at the heart of that, this desire to marginalize the authority of the church, precisely because God had wedded himself, you might say, to reality, introduced a break with the real. And I think Western history can be read as the gradual revelation of the implications of this movement away from the real. So I think we are living in a time of a kind of reaping the consequences of that break from hundreds of years ago. We're beginning to see that there really is nothing that's holding us to the earth and to the real and to nature and the intrinsic meanings of things and truth, beauty, and goodness, and all of these sort of foundational realities. We've lost the principle that binds us to them, and we've generated, in its place, all sorts of virtual substitutes, which are increasingly dominating our economics, our politics, our science, our healthcare, our law. I mean, you name it. All of our institutions are reflecting this.
Right. It's interesting. I love how you talk about the etymology of the symbolic versus the diabolic, and this idea that the symbolic binds together, connects. The diabolic is that which fragments. And this way of looking at reality is nothing but a bunch of bits of stuff, whether it's bits of information or I really love when you talked about we see food as just bits of nutrition, as opposed to seeing the wholeness. It almost seems like what's been lost is a whole sense of a formal cause, that things have an orienting principle, and it's not just this reduction of things into bits, this fragmenting.
Yeah, I mean, that the diabolical is such a rich word in terms of its symbolic resonance as well. I mean, that you have principles that separate us from reality and from each other. I mean, that basically disrupt relationships, but there's something deceptive about it at the same time. It's an attempt. There's an attempt to compensate for what's being destroyed or ignored by then a replacement, an ersatz, a substitute. And the problem is that the closer the substitute comes to the reality, in a way, the more dangerous it is. So, but the point that you made is really a lovely one. I think for a while, people would talk about the loss of final causality, purpose, teleology.
Yeah.
We don't have a sense of purpose, and I think that's true and in a very important point. But in a more subtle way, I think that the greater loss is the loss of form, as you say. We don't relate to things as realities in themselves that have their own intelligibility. We think that what they represent to us is simply a configuration of smaller bits, and so we end up living that way. That our form of life ends up expressing the same sort of fragmentation, and you try to piece things together in order to compensate again for the loss of this sense of unity. But the reality of food, as you mentioned, the reality of the family, the integrity of the person, body and soul, the integrity of any sort of a community. You just go on and on. The integrity of
Does
nature.
that connect to going back to what you said about beauty? Like, I love where you connect. I always loved the definition of love as willing the good of the other as other, and it wasn't until reading you that I saw that that's true, but it's not.
Yeah.
It's not the fullness of what love
Right.
is, and it really made me. And it has to do with this apprehension of unity.
Yeah.
I thought that was very, very, very beautiful and really important to recover.
No, to me that also was when I stumbled on. You read some sections of the Summa over and over again, even teach them and not notice some things that are just staring you right in the face. But when Aquinas asked the question whether love is the same as benevolence, and etymologically speaking, it means having a will to the good of the other. He asks whether these are the same, and he says, no, you can have benevolence towards someone you've never met. So what's the difference? And he says that, and he's drawing on Aristotle here, that love implies not just having a good will, but having a bond of affection. I started to realize, okay, bond, that's kind of interesting, because that's a note that you don't get so much in Greek philosophy as being essential to love, but it's certainly when you think of the covenantal form of love in the Jewish tradition, and that gets taken up into Christianity, you realize that notion of bond actually has a more important sense than we tend to realize, especially when you think of then the Holy Spirit. The special names of the Spirit in the Trinity are gift and love, but as Augustine says, Spirit is also the bond of love between the Father and Son, and it's not the act of will. There's a given bond, a connection that holds them together, and it's really important for us to recover a sense of love as, of course it includes willing the good of the other, but we will the good of the other precisely because we're in a relationship. We have a bond to the other that we first receive. So our very first act, this is why Aquinas says love is a passion. It's something we undergo. Our first act is to receive and recognize the goodness of the other, and that draws us into relation, which we then confirm through a discrete act of will. So, when we make our own act of will, we're kind of appropriating and taking responsibility for, in a way, this bond that we're in. But it's the second moment. The first is the bond itself.
That's beautiful. Yeah. Is that, do you see, and as you look over, the course of Western philosophy, an absence of a real sort of thinking through the implications of love?
Thank you for that question. I used to teach a course years ago called The Problem of Love, which, that was my favorite course when I first started teaching. The point of the course was to raise this question about whether love was essentially a matter of desire. Was self-love or love of the other? How do you reconcile? How do you put these things together? And eros and agape is a way some people put it. I think that's a problematic opposition, but that's for another day.
Sure.
So, and the point of the course then was to raise this general question, which I think we all have just an instinctive interest in. It's something that the students were always, no matter what, they were forced to take these philosophy classes that they had no desire to take, but that question would just strike everyone. There, as you say, there's kind of a general hunger for love, as John Paul II says so beautifully in Redemptor Hominis. But what I found so interesting is that this theme of love was a major theme in classical philosophers, in the sort of ancient tradition, and in medieval philosophers, but that it effectively disappears as a philosophical theme for centuries, except on the margins. And that's an interesting thing to think about, why that might be the case. I think a big part of it is that in the ancient world, love was recognized as having a kind of an ontological and a cosmological reach. It had to do with the very meaning of reality. It was substantial. The meaning of reality, not just human beings and human feelings, but the structure of the universe even. And it's what moves the planets, as Dante said. And in the modern era, we tend to think of it more in purely subjective terms. It's feelings that you have. It's an experience. It's something that only concerns human beings or maybe their pets. But it loses this kind of genuinely political dimension and genuinely ontological, cosmological dimension. And I think that's so then it becomes the stuff of novels and sitcoms and so forth. It's not really about the meaning of life. But I think there's a turn back. I think now, one might say, because things have gotten so topsy-turvy in the culture, we're becoming capable of raising fundamental questions in ways that wouldn't have been really possible just decades ago. And I think there's a kind of a new interest in all sorts of basic realities, but one of them is certainly this recovery of this deep sense of love.
One of the things you say about beauty is this: it's an encounter between the soul,
and
it's a meeting ground. It's the reality of things appear to us, and yet on the subjective side, we have the space to receive. And I found that to be very, very moving. There's this recovery of the appearance of things, not just as a kind of reductionism where we could say, well, that's just this, and that's just meeting our senses, and we have no actual the kind of Kantian move. We have no access to what's out there, but actually to recover the appearance of things and to see beauty as this meeting ground. And I wonder, because I've always been very sensitive to the ugliness of the modern world. You go to Europe and small towns, and your body immediately feels like you can relax. You can feel like
you feel elevated.
You feel at home.
Yeah,
you do, and moved, and you go to some of the functional, sort of like a strip mall, and you're like, there's no sense of anything other than pure functionality here in terms of this structure. And I'm wondering, could you say more about like why is the modern world so at times ugly? And how do we recover beauty in all of its aspects?
Well, that's a huge question. If I could answer that question, I deserve a Nobel Prize. No, I mean, first of all, with this sort of subjectivizing of love, it's connected to a subjectivizing of beauty. I mean, we tend to just think of beauty as, in the eye of the beholder, and really not meaning anything. It's something we all enjoy experiencing, but it doesn't really mean anything, and it doesn't carry a weight. But I think that's a perversion of what beauty is. And one of the tasks in recovering a substantial sense of love is also a substantial sense of beauty. Realizing that it really is an encounter. I think the note of reality is helpful. In beauty, we're encountering reality. It's the being of things that are offering themselves in their appearance. So it's not just appearance that we see, but it's the being of things in their appearance. I mean, you think about it. this theme of the mother's smile in the work of Hans von Balthasar, as one awakens to consciousness through the smile of the mother, the baby is able to smile back, and we recognize that as one of the first conscious acts. What's interesting about that, you just think of how much is loaded into this. The baby is not just imitating a surface moving of the lips. The baby actually experiences the mother, who is communicating herself to the child in this in her face, in the gesture of her face, in a way that the baby is able to perceive and internalize and experiences that as beauty. And it's interesting. It's precisely that encounter with the reality of the mother in the appearance of her smile that's a radiant beauty that allows the baby then to enter into the whole world of meaningfulness. So this really becomes a kind of a banner under which one ought to sort of perceive the whole world. And you recognize then why things like the breakdown of the family are so tragic, because there's something so vital about this entry into reality. Now, if you expand that analogically to the world generally, that kind of invitation to reality that we experience in the mother's smile should be experienced in the beauty of the house that we live in, and the neighborhood and the town square. That all of these things should be an invitation to reality. That then gives us a proper place in the world, and then allows us to interact with each other in real freedom.
Yeah. Could you say more about the quality of disinterestedness, which in terms of beauty, that it's not trying to get something out of you. There's not cash value to this. It's something. Yeah. There's something that is it's done for its own sake.
That's right. I mean, people obviously misunderstand that word in all sorts of ways, and that was a theme in Kant. And Kant is always one of my arch enemies in philosophy. Sure. But I've also learned some things from him, and especially in the question of beauty. I think that's I would interpret it radically differently from the way he does. But this notion of a kind of disinterestedness, that doesn't mean lack of interest. It means that you're not measuring the experience by what need it satisfies in yourself. So it may indeed, in fact, if it's really beautiful, it will satisfy a need, but that's not what measures it. It's not defined by its capacity to fill a need. It's defined by its own glory, you might say, its own radiance. And the satisfaction is a kind of a secondary implication. And I think that's really fruit that's essential, because it's what allows, its wide beauty actually liberates freedom and allows us, in fact, to interact with each other in free ways that respects the dignity of each of us and of the world that we live in, and so forth.
Could you say more, just the idea that beauty liberates freedom is a really interesting. So freedom needing to be liberated is a really interesting idea. That's
right. Yeah, that's more important than people. Absolutely. Christ set us free for freedom. As it says in Galatians. I mean, that's crucial. Why is that? I mean, it's actually connected to this understanding of love. We are able to freely will the other person because we've been elevated and enabled through the experience of beauty that, in a way, gives the soul the capacity, the proper disposition, and the capacity to pursue the other properly, and to will the other and to interact with the other. So, in a way, it sets the conditions under which the will is able to operate with integrity, and that's why beauty frees us. It frees us because it inspires the love without which the will's always going to be locked in itself. It won't ever really be able to make contact with the other.
Right, right. And without that, you have a kind of empty notion of freedom as pure potentiality which never actualizes itself. It's nothing other than my power to choose whatever I want.
Yeah, and it's power, and power that can't actualize itself without, in a certain sense, getting lost. And so that's why it's, I like the diabolical. It's a power that needs to hold on to it, to keep from making. It's the power to choose that can't ever commit to a choice, because to commit to a choice is to surrender the power to choose something else. It's to limit oneself, and so you end up in a way trying to enhance and fortify this separation from reality rather than recognizing that it's the bond with the real that gives us freedom, and why then our committing through choice is crucial to actually becoming free.
What happens when that notion of freedom, that more impoverished notion of freedom, becomes the very bedrock for organizing the social order? Again, that's too. It's a
big question. But I mean, just I think that's basically what we have. We're attempting to try to stay out of each other's way. So we establish these political systems, legal systems, economic systems that gives us the most space possible to in a way experience choice, but not ever really even to. The point isn't to choose. I mean, the point is in a way to that. I mean, that's why we choose we want to feel free even more than actually being free.
The social order is set up such that we are told that we can go about and live in accord with our own, subjective choices, our own conception of what's meaningful, or worship our own gods and all of that. And it seems very nice and tolerant, and why not? You can have everything you had in the Middle Ages. Yeah. It just creates more room for everybody else to do what they need to do.
That's right.
But yet, it's also, in claiming that it's not proposing a metaphysics, it also is proposing a metaphysics, namely that there is no objective truth, and that the social order is organized around that kind of relativistic principle. What does that ultimately do? And I'm just curious in terms of where we are today as a culture, as a society. What are the long-term ramifications of living that way, over the course of centuries?
Well, look around. This is what happens. I find really fascinating to think about here that the famous mystery of life clause from Casey versus Planned Parenthood about that the heart of freedom is the capacity to choose your own meaning of existence and so forth, and you realize that sounds like you are investing people with this extraordinary power. But I mean, you realize if you think about for a moment what's implied in it, you can choose any meaning to give to reality as long as it actually has absolutely no meaning for anybody else.
Right. Yeah.
And in fact, not even any meaning for you that you couldn't change in the very next second. So you're given this power at the cost of it being totally meaningless by its very essence. You by taking away, in a certain sense, any capacity to rest in a given reality that gives us meaning. We're in a certain sense and this is the irony is, without our choosing, we've been this absolute sense of freedom has been imposed on us, and what results is this void at the center of our existence that then each of us has the task, the endless, Sisyphean task of trying to fill with some meaning that can't ever stick because it can change in every second. And so there's this incredible burden that we all feel to try to create, to have to create identities that again, can't stick anywhere, and so they're not even really identities, and so it becomes this sort of radical restlessness, and the implications are despair, suicide, a kind of social erosion. I mean, all of the kinds of things that we read about in the papers every day.
Right. I thought it was really interesting when you talk about the different ways in which one can approach the situation. You mentioned Nietzsche's will to power, which is just to sort of double down on the will and to choose. Yeah. Heidegger's Gelassenheit, which is a kind of not choosing, which is very similar, because I found for a while in my own journey the whole approach of Zen very appealing, and then I found myself in this place of kind of blissed out, I'm just going to release, let go, but then what do you do with that? There's a lack of the mission, which I think Balthasar was really his whole coming, that whole spirituality of a mission, doing a specific thing. Yeah. But I didn't know what to do. You'd go into a meditative state, and the Nietzschean thing never was super appealing, but that's certainly, the great man who goes and does the great deeds. Yeah. But the options available to us are, without that orienting principle, it seems to double down on willpower, achievement, or to check out in a way.
Right. Right.
I don't know. Are there other options that it seems like
or try to create artificial communities, based on this or that. But that's and then try to generate meaning by political activism and this sort of revolutionary spirit that
the Marxist,
is the Marxist and and some of the radical right, bonding together against enemies that we are, that we sort of see everywhere. I mean, they're all kinds of sort of, I'm sure that you studied psychology. You said that the textbooks are probably filled with lists of ways people try to maneuver out of this meaninglessness. But I mean, that's basically what we're doing. And this has personal expressions and cultural expressions. In this sort of horizon of despair that we've just painted together here. I mean, the one thing that is amazing about Christianity, in contrast to Nietzsche and Heidegger and these things that you mentioned, is that reality itself. Here we got come around full circle. God entered into the real and bound himself to it, which means that God is present in the smallest things, which means that reality, in a certain sense, qualified sense, reality itself can save us, and reality is not something that we need to go on a great world tour to find. It's in a way, it's always stares us in the face. So the simplest human activities, being true to a friendship, setting up a home, taking care of one's parents, these sort of simple tasks can actually be incredibly, subversive in relation to these cultural drifts in ways that I think are always there to discover, and they're always going to be new and unique for each person.
Isn't that the temptation would be to start to go and be another revolutionary, or to do things on this macro scale, as opposed to what you're saying, which is the incarnational principle of going very small.
That's right. And there might be some people that have the big missions, but most of us don't. And but that that is not something to regret if we don't have a big mission. We get to the same place, but it's a shorter trip. Because it's in our home, and it's just as cosmic in a way, and ontological, the implications of these things. So we can always get. Madeleine Delbrel is a really beautiful figure here. I don't know if you're familiar with her. I think her cause for sainthood is open, but her idea of a kind of ordinary mysticism, that we can get to the very heart of reality. It's always sort of available to us. We're riding a metro or doing some work. It's always available to us. I mean, that's a sign of hope.
Yeah. I mean, I found it, I find it really interesting that your own move in your intellectual journey to looking at politics, to looking at what a real deep analysis of liberalism, and then I'm just curious in terms of where you're at right now.
Yeah.
I know you were looking at the question of authority,
Right.
which is remarkably interesting.
I've actually come to see that all of the things that we've been discussing are connected to the question of authority and the loss of a sense of authority in ways that I had never really anticipated before. But I think this is going to be a theme. I mean, it certainly has become a theme for me, but I gather that this is a growing theme for many people. I think it's going to be something that lots of us are talking about in the next decade or so.
Yeah. I think the what comes through in your writing is a real, I think a love of wisdom. There's a way in which I just find myself being led to contemplation when I read your work. There's a depth and a real profundity. So I'm grateful to you for devoting yourself to this work and for sharing it with us, and for all of the generosity that you've shown as well with your time for some of our projects. But
yeah,
that's
thank
just
you
a joy to be able to sit down and talk with you.
Yeah, no, thank you for your work. Your work, in contrast to mine, will be experienced by many people, rather than the few in their studies. But I think there's a real service that you're performing. So thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate it, and look forward to hopefully having future conversations as well. But thanks again for your time, dude.
Cheers.